Hi guys, welcome to the first summary of the podcast. This is episode 103 with Eric Helms. Just to give you a kind of idea of what these summary podcasts are going to provide, is basically 5 take-home points from the podcast, so that once you've listened to the full podcast, you can come back to this and refer to it, and it can give you a bit of a recap. Or if you haven't got time to watch the entire podcast, you can watch this now and then. We definitely don't want this to be a replacement for the podcast, but more of a great addition to it. So you can enjoy these. I am, of course, Steve Hall, the podcast host, and we'll get straight into today's summary points. The first summary point I want you to take away from this podcast is that you should probably be using loads of at least 20% of your 1 rep max for muscular hypertrophy. And even these need to be taken very close, if not completely, to failure. Less than 20% of your 1 rep max and you're probably not really getting anything much. Remember, muscle hypertrophy requires a certain amount of mechanical tension on the muscles. Past newbie stage, like going for a run or cycling, isn't going to provide any muscular hypertrophy. So when you're thinking about what loads to pick, don't pick the pink dumbbells too often if they're too light for you. Go for heavier loads, they're going to provide more tension, and then you can take these not all the way to failure, but 20% or less is probably not heavy enough to provide a stimulus for muscular hypertrophy. The second point I want you to take away from this podcast is that the general pop person who goes to just a commercial gym is probably not going hard enough. They probably are leaving too many reps in the tank. Whereas when we're talking about us guys, us bodybuilders, powerlifters, physique athletes, we're probably going too hard most of the time without keeping things in check. So it's really important to be aware of this, and when you're talking to your audience or programming for someone, is to bear this in mind. The commercial gym users, those day-to-day people who are generally exercising and not so much training, they probably could do with going a little bit harder. Whereas for us guys who very often train maybe too hard too often and don't accrue as much volume as we could and don't manage our fatigue as well as we could, we're probably better off leaving some reps in the tank so that we can go harder further in the future and accumulate good volume. The third point I want you to take away from this podcast, and it was a point I thought was brilliant, was that Eric spoke about how supplements, as you know, in his muscle and strength pyramids, for the nutritional portion, they are at the top of the pyramid, i.e. calories are the baseline, macronutrients, nutritional timing, food composition, that all comes before supplementation. So it's the icing on the cake in the first place. And then for supplements that are new, under-researched, they're really ones that maybe you shouldn't actually try. Even if there is some studies showing that they could be beneficial, there could be a bunch of studies coming in future that shows they're actually detrimental, and this has been found with some supplements. So things like creatine, caffeine, these have been shown time and time again to have major ergogenic benefits for your workouts. So they're things that you could for sure take and know they're going to help you and not be a detriment. Whereas something new on the market could be a bit fishy, you're not completely sure. So you're better to hedge your bets and not go with it rather than go with it. The fourth point I want you to take away from this podcast is if you are dieting, you probably want to prioritize carbohydrates around your workout window. Remember, when you're dieting, you're in a calorie deficit. This means your muscle glycogen stores are quite often going to be quite low and potentially fairly depleted. So it's a good idea to get a bunch of carbohydrates around your workout so that you can store some glycogen prior to your workout, top off your muscular glycogen stores so you have plenty for your workout, and then also after your workout to recover from it, but definitely before your workout. This is where nutritional timing can really make a difference, especially when you're on the leaner side or have been dieting for longer, such as bodybuilding, competitors, physique athletes. You guys, when you're getting into your prep, nutritional timing and where you put your carbohydrates is going to be quite important. So that's the takeaway there. The fifth and final point I want you to take away from this podcast is that when Eric Helms is giving his protein requirements and his protein recommendations, this is counting all sources of protein. So it's not just high quality protein sources from whole proteins or like chicken, beef, animal proteins, dairy products. Not just the ones that have the entire amino acid profile, but still those that you're getting from grains, your oats, your bread, your vegetables. He is including all protein within that protein recommendation. So when you see a recommendation of 1 gram per pound, that is including everything within your diet. You aren't to just pick and choose those higher quality sources. Finally, guys, I want to leave you with my favorite quote from the podcast, and that was that training to failure is not a requirement. You don't have to train to failure to see the results that you want within the gym for hypertrophy. And in fact, if you train to failure too often, you could in fact hold back progress because you won't be hitting as much volume as you possibly could be doing. And this is still effective volume, effective reps. And that is important. Training to failure is not a requirement. It is something that you might want to do now and then and periodize and maybe hit on certain movements or maybe on the last set on a certain exercise, but it's not something you want to try and achieve every single time you go to the gym. It will create risk for injury, it will create a lot of fatigue, and it will probably blunt your progress. So cheers, guys. Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to the summary. This is the first one. If you enjoyed this, if you would like to see anything more about this, please let me know, and we will talk to you guys soon. Cheers and take care.